Hello again. For the first part of this segment, or for today's episode, what I'd like to do is start to talk about some of the founders of the quality movement and some of the philosophies that are directly tied to these individuals. Now, to give you a little bit of context of what's going on, you'll find that most of these people, most of this work is post World War II. The only exception is right at the beginning, and we'll talk about Walter Schruert when we get going, but Walter Schruert predates the Second World War, and a lot of his work is in the 1930s. But he's really a pioneer, and he's actually one of these people that bridges the gap between um, classical organizational theory and the beginning of human relations theory, which we'll talk about later in the semester, and the beginning of the quality movement, and kind of where some of that stuff starts to branch off from. In the context of post World War II, globally, an awful lot of the industrial capability in the world has been destroyed, certainly in a lot of the developed parts of the world. Europe is that way for sure. Large parts of Germany is destroyed. Large parts of France and Italy and Greece and, throughout the Balkan areas and into Russia. And there's an awful lot of decimation in Europe, UK as well. But in the Far East, Japan is been particularly hard hit, and in fact, you'll find the roots of most of the quality stuff comes out of Japan, and it comes out of the rebuilding experience that happens. So, post World War II, as the Japanese economy starts to get rebuilt, largely with American money, by the way, and American expertise, early forays into getting things going again and restarting the manufacturing process and finding customers and products to produce and all that other stuff. The Japanese have an experience where they're able to produce and their costing for their production is not bad. However, they're having challenges from a quality standpoint. There's a fair bit of inconsistency. If you had spoke to most, certainly Western customers, in the say 1950s about something that was made in Japan, what kind of um, quality levels they would expect from something made there versus made in America, for example, and most people would expect it to be of inferior quality. That provided the opportunity for Japan to really focus on how do we solve these quality problems? Because this seems to be what differentiates or potentially could differentiate us from other manufacturers in other countries around the world. So this is one of the reasons why you see so much focus that happens through the 1950s and 60s, particularly on dealing with quality issues in the manufacturing setting. And this is where Joe Duran, really does most of his foundational work, and where Edward Deming makes most of his influential work, is in this kind of context. So when the Japanese overcome a lot of their issues, and certainly from a North American standpoint, this starts to become very, very well known in the latter part of the 1970s, so mid 70s to the into the 80s, and the context for this is really in the automotive industry. So the automotive industry is an incredibly large business with an awful lot of spin-offs. In any country that has an automotive industry, it's a huge producer. There's an awful lot of products that are produced. There's a high ownership of vehicles in a lot of parts of the world, and the supply chain that feeds into it for all the various different parts and everything else is a very, very big part of a lot of economies. Canada certainly is no exception. And in fact, Ontario historically had been one of the industrial powerhouses of Canada, and a big part of that was actually the auto industry. Now it's changed somewhat over the years, and it's kind of a shadow of its former self, but it was a very, very big thing at the time. The experience that most North Americans would have had, and I can remember this as a kid. I can remember my dad buying a 1973 Oldsmobile. And when you bought a new car, one of the things you would do is you keep a notebook and a pencil or a pen or something like that in the car. And the first couple of weeks that you had it, you would write down all the things that didn't work. right? This window won't roll up, and this is back with roll-up windows, by the way, not necessarily power windows, but this window won't roll up. This doesn't come on correctly. This makes a rattling noise. The initial fit and finish and the quality of major North American manufacturer, right? So Oldsmobile is part of the General Motors umbrella, and GM, Ford, and Chrysler were the big three at the time, um, producing in North America. And that was just kind of the way things were. Everybody was the same. Like whether you bought a Chevy or whether you bought a Ford or whether you bought a Chrysler, like in a lot of cases, it was a similar kind of experience. And part of it is it's even back then, it's a fairly difficult piece of kit to put together correctly. There's an awful lot of systems that have to come together and have to work with each other. They have to operate in very harsh environments. If you think of the Canadian climate, for example, we have very, very cold times of the year and we have very, very hot times of the year. And in transitional periods, like in spring and fall, you can be below zero in the morning and you can be over 20 degrees centigrade in the afternoon, same day, right? And that provides some real challenges with material fits and finish, right? Because with one of the things that happens obviously with expansion and contraction, with heat cycles changing and things like that. So it's not an easy thing to do, right? So certainly one can understand how they had the challenges that they had. But what happened in the early 70s is there was a challenge with oil. So it was often referred to as the oil crisis. I won't go to a lot of detail. I mean, you can Google this, what happened. But basically what it did is it made North Americans, particularly Americans, really, really concerned about access to fuel and the cost of fuel. Gasoline had traditionally always been much less expensive in the US and Canada than it had in Europe and Japan and a lot of other places in the world, which is one of the reasons why you tended to see larger vehicles in North America than you did in other parts of the world. Some of it had to do with cost of fuel. A lot of it has to do with the way cities are built and congestion and things like that too. But in any case, in the context when the oil crisis happened, what happened is there was a rise in prices. There was some scarcity, right? And it was well publicized in the news. There were shortages. There were big lineups of gas stations that didn't have enough gas to feed. And North Americans really started to become concerned about their access to gasoline. This created a window of opportunity to look at and be interested in smaller, more fuel efficient cars, which previously had maybe a niche following in North America. Just about everything were big gas guzzlers. This opportunity provided some some good focus for the Japanese because their models had been smaller, their models had been more fuel efficient, and although they had started importing and selling in North America in the 60s, they had pretty limited success because it really was kind of a niche market. And it wasn't until you had the oil crisis that really people started to pivot in a more meaningful way towards these more fuel efficient vehicles. Well, one of the first things that happened as people purchased some of these for the first time is that they found that the initial fit and finish of these was far better than the experience that they'd had with the North American cars, right? They worked. You didn't have loose things. You didn't have things that rattled. You didn't have like all of that kind of stuff was much, much better than it had been in the North American car experience. In fact, I mean, I had a friend of mine, his dad had bought an early Datsun, which is the Nissan company today, but had bought an early Nissan, and the thing just went. Like it worked great. They had problems with rusting, and certainly the use of salt and the environmental challenges in North America that you didn't see in Japan played a role early on. But by the same token, North American cars rusted it pretty easily at the same time period anyhow. And it didn't take the Japanese very long before they got their handle on the rusting issues. But mechanically, it was awesome. Like it just, you put gas in it, you got the oil changed every so often and stuff, and it ran. And this really started to make people understand the ramifications of fit and finish and quality and all of those other dimensions that we talked about last time. And this started the change in the industry. And you saw it happen through the 80s and 90s and so on. And certainly in Canada today, if you look through any particular parking lot, you know, back in the early 70s, everything would have been from the big three, right? It would have been a General Motors, a Ford, or a Chrysler product. I mean, you almost never saw anything else. And today, the only time you see products from the big three is if it's an SUV or if it's a pickup truck. Those are about the only times you see them anymore. Sedan market is long gone to those. It's gone to the Europeans, it's gone to the Japanese, it's gone to the South Koreans. And regardless of what the North American manufacturers try, other than some niche models like Mustang and stuff like that, it's gone and it's not coming back. And this was part and parcel of this change and this part of the quality movement. So let me get started on kind of the material, the first section of the material that I want to talk about today. Okay, so let me move myself down a little bit so it's maybe a little easier for you to see me there. Okay, I'm going to skip over, not because quality planning assurance and everything, that's part of the Duran trilogy that we'll talk about. What I really wanted to do was kind of pick up from this spot. So I'm going to talk about Shruart, Duran, and Deming today. And then in the next segment, we'll look at PDCA and we'll look at Crosby and we'll look at Ishikawa and a bunch of others. So as I'd mentioned, Walter Shruart's the only one that predates World War II. And he's often looked at the father of statistical quality control. You can see his Economic Quality Control and Manufactured Goods was published in 1931, right? Which is an interesting time. That's really the beginnings of the Great Depression. So a tremendous economic downturn worldwide. And one of the repercussions is there's a lot more interest now in how do you produce things more efficiently, because more efficiently means more cost efficiently, and more cost efficiently means that you have a better chance of being able to sell, and you have a better chance of being able to do something in a profitable environment. So it's in that context that a lot of this stuff starts to come up. You'll see later in the course when we look at some of the early human relations theory work, it actually is starting at about this same period of time. And they kind of branch off, and you see a lot of development in both spaces post-World War II. Anyhow, big things for Shruart, and if you're keeping up with the textbook, this is the stuff in chapter 12. So you want to look at control charts, right? So one of the big things from Shruart is the control chart. And the control chart is a way of looking at the behaviors of what's happening. So behavioral process, or the dimensions of things that we're producing. So basically looking at statistics related to the manufacturing that you're doing and understanding that there are different things that can happen. And the way he talks about them is you look at special causes and common causes and being able to distinguish between special and common causes. And also in being able to figure out what's an appropriate level of variation, right? One of the things when we looked at dimensions of quality, one of the key things is that higher quality is usually less variability. That's less variance from what you're actually trying to do. Well, there's some level of variability that will take place. How much is acceptable really depends on the demands of your customer. And it can be defined within the context of a control chart. What's an acceptable level of variation? Well, that level of variation, right, it is referred to as a common cause. A special cause is something that would cause that variation to break either the upper control limit or the lower control limit. And that's kind of an event that's happened. One of the cool things that control charts let you do is they let you look at behavioral patterns for a process that's even when it's still under control. But when you see changes in those patterns, it's an early indication of something that may in fact lead to an out of control situation, so that you can actually get prescriptive and you can start looking at what might be a problem before it actually becomes a problem, right? Which I go back to, best way to deal with quality issues is to prevent them. And a big part of prevention is being able to see early signs or indicators that might indicate something might be happening. So control charts are a really big thing for Shruart. He's a mentor for both Duran and Deming. Another big part of him is the beginning of trying to change people's minds. So one of the first early quality stuff that you ever see most companies do is inspections, where they start inspecting things. And in fact, his lot by lot inspection is one thing that's attributed to Shruart. Inspection is great for telling you have a problem. Inspection does nothing about fixing the problem. It is an important piece of the puzzle, but it's not a substitution for the prevention activities. And the beginning of that thought process really does start with Shruart. You see this, his plan, do, check, act, which is basically kind of the cycle of that. You plan what you're going to do, you actually do it. You check to see whether you're getting the results that you're looking for, and then based on the results that you see in your check, you act on those things, right? Hey, I was trying to make this, and it was supposed to be 25 millimeters in dimension, and I have a tolerance plus or minus 1 millimeter, and then I start checking things. Did I actually get that? If I did, that's great. If I didn't do that, why didn't I do it? How much of it did I not do for it? And then there's a whole series of things that you would do to try to make alterations to make sure that you produce what it is that you were looking for. Okay, so Short's the first one. Next one that we're going to talk about is Edward Deming. So Deming and Juran, as I alluded to before, both kind of made their names in the quality space in Japan post-World War II, working in various different industries. I think Deming was far more auto, and I think Juran had a little more even spread over a number of different manufacturing organizations. In any case, they developed, in cooperation with the work that they did with these companies and lots of other people in Japan, a variety of theories that they were able to prove through the manufacturing processes and the approaches that these manufacturers took. So one of the key things that are attributable to Deming, right, is the first one that I'm going to talk about is what's referred to as chain reaction. And that's when I improve my quality, it lowers my cost. Lowering my costs makes me more efficient. Being more efficient lets me do things that I couldn't do normally, which lets me capture more market share. That provides more jobs. The company stays in business longer. It's basically this reaction. When I fix quality, here are all the positive benefits that come from it and how they link it together. Chain reaction is probably most important in the context of both Deming and Juran came back to North America, specifically the US, in the early 80s. And they were preaching to American businesses about why they were losing to the Japanese and the things that they needed to do differently in order to be able to be competitive to the Japanese manufacturers now. This chain reaction was actually part of Deming's communication back here in North America, because the early parts of quality, a lot of industries looked at it like it was a religious or a faith thing. It was often referred to as kind of like the second coming of Christ. And he looked at it far more practically, that it had nothing to do, and although there are definitely societal benefits and concerns that are tied up with quality, he looked at it from a practical standpoint, saying, look, if you want to be successful in your business, improving your quality makes you more effective. Being more effective lets you do things your competitors can't do. Based on that, you'll capture more market share. Based on that, your business will be allowed to grow. You can provide more jobs. There's more money for making various different investments. Basically, it's not just a societal issue, although it definitely has those variations to it. His 14 points of transformation is exactly this messaging. So this is messaging of what he's learned from the years in Japan to a North American audience for about things that they need to do differently. And we'll talk about some of this more when we live, because I think it works a little bit better then. But you do want to make sure that you're familiar with some of the key points throughout these 14 points that he has. He also came up with the 7 deadly diseases, which again, this is from what he learned, this is information focused back at a North American audience. And this is basically saying why they're having the problems that they're having that are resulting in quality issues, which is resulting in them losing business to Japanese and German and a variety of other manufacturers that have gotten better at these dimensions. And again, we'll talk in some more details about some of these specifics. Next person is very, very, very important is Joe Juran, right? So similar time period, similar kind of experience, makes their name in the space in Japan. Early 1980s, back in North America, preaching and trying to help American businesses transform themselves. Key parts of Juran's teachings refers to as the different concepts of quality. And we talked about this in the 8 dimensions, right? Where I talked about there's some dimensions that are kind of more feature related, where more features or more expensive materials or things like that, where higher quality tends to cost more. And then there's a series of dimensions of quality that have to do with efficiency and fit and finish and how effective you are and lack of defects, in which case higher quality is less money. And as I said, these two coexist simultaneously, right? But all of those dimensions together have an effect on the overall quality. The father of what's referred to as the Duran trilogy, which is the quality planning, quality control, and quality improvement. So they're each distinct phases that are circular, right? So you start with your quality planning. Your quality control takes place while you're doing whatever the process or manufacturing is that you're doing. And then the quality improvement is the cycle where you look at, well, how do I do things better tomorrow than I did them yesterday? And it's this constant evolution. Um, and each of these three segments coexist all the time. Like you don't do one and then move to the next and then move to the next. There are aspects of a process that move from one to another. But as an organization, you'd forever be planning, you'd forever be controlling, and you'd be forever be improving. He also looked at the ownership for quality throughout the entire organization. And you'll find this is common in any TQM or total quality management um, teachings, is that quality is responsibility of the entire organization from the top all the way through. And the top is your strategic level, the middle is your operational, and your front line is your workforce level. And the role that they play does change depending on where you are, but all three of those levels are, at the same time, jointly responsible for the outcomes. So one of the other big things that you'll get from Duran is his quality definition, right? So we talked about one being more income oriented, or that's more about the features where higher quality is more money. And then there's the more cost oriented, higher quality is less money. As I said, these do operate simultaneously. Here's an overview of the trilogy, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the live sections. Talked about this. Is process approach to improvement, is three levels of quality management we talked about, right? So your strategic, which is your top of the organization, your operational, which is your middle level, and your workforce, which is the front. And they all do different things, right? Like strategic is much more about planning, policies, so on and so forth. Operational is more about how do you translate the plans into operation. And workforce is much more about the controlling of, as we're working on things, what kinds of bumps in the road do we have to deal with? What kind of hiccups are there for us to keep us on track? But the things that the workforce does feeds back into operational, which feeds back into strategic. So they are all linked into each other. And I'm going to leave it there for today for this segment. The next segment will pick up on Philip Crosby. I'll see you then.